working for your entertainment. Okay, so where did we leave off? I guess it was still springtime for Hitler and Germany. Really, right into, shall we say, the summer of 1940. Things are still going Hitler's way, improbably. I mean, after all, he had made all these risky moves, you might say, on the international chessboard. The war hadn't even turned out really the way he wanted. He didn't want Britain to fight, remember, in 1939. He didn't really want to have to deal with France. He didn't think they were going to fight over Poland. The paradox, of course, is that Hitler was very successful in the West, in Europe, even though that was never really his concern. To a certain extent, he shared this vision, almost a prejudice, the Eastern strategy, you might call it, with some of the generals in World War I, like Ludendorff, even to some extent with the politicians. The Locarno Treaty of 1925, you may remember, or you may not remember, the Germans actually accepted their western borders. That is, they accepted losing Alsace-Lorraine to France, simply because it was not considered terribly important for German foreign policy. If you look on the map, and I'm going to pass around here just a map, essentially, of Hitler's conquest of the Second World War. I mean, you can see why, in a way, geographically, the Germans were so obsessed with the East by what Hitler called Lebensraum, or essentially the notion of living space. Now, some of this was due to his racial theory. We'll look at that in a moment, his kind of vision of what the future Germany should look like, replacing the Slavic and particularly, of course, the Jewish populations of Eastern Europe with Germanic settlers. All of that was part of his, you might say, ideological vision. But geographically, it kind of made sense. To the east was a vast plain, where the German army, once it kind of broke free from this iron triangle, particularly in Central Europe involving the mountains of the Sudetenland, could simply roam free, almost as it wanted, as it wished. It was a good area for an army of a war of movement. Western Europe was just kind of, was more like a sore. You know, it was like a thorn in Hitler's backside. He just needed his flank secure. It was kind of an accident that he chose first to secure his eastern flank with, if you remember, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That is, first he kind of iced over the eastern front by cutting this deal with Stalin. Now, incidentally, this deal was a serious one. It wasn't just that they carved up Poland together, that Stalin got, if you remember, famously a free hand. You know, he tells the Latvian foreign minister, so far as Germany is concerned, we can occupy you. So Stalin rolls up the Baltic states. Stalin invades Finland, of course, 1939 to 1940. I haven't even really talked about that campaign. The Russians actually did not do that well in Finland, in part because their soldiers simply were not as well trained. The Finns particularly had expertise in things like, well, I don't know how to put it more directly than this, basically warfare on skis. I mean, it was almost like a James Bond movie, except it was mostly your sort of cross-country skiing. You know, they had all of these expert marksmen, you know, highly trained, warriors who were able to essentially surround the Russians, get behind them, cut off their lines. The Russians did very poorly in the Finnish campaign. In the end, Finland cut a deal, accepted the loss of some of its territory north of Petrograd, now called Leningrad, mostly because they just didn't want to have to keep fighting the Russians, because eventually Russia, being a huge country, could just keep sending, of course, more and more men in. The Red Army didn't perform well, but its vast size eventually convinced the Finns just to kind of cut a deal. But this reinforced the impression, that is the, shall we say, spotty record of the Red Army in Finland, reinforced the impression in the West, particularly in Hitler's mind, that the Red Army was kind of a paper tiger. I talked about how the Germans, in fact, the Germans believed they themselves had helped to sabotage the Red Army by feeding Stalin information about Marshal Tukhachevsky and other generals and field marshals whom he had purged in the late 30s. So a lot of Germans thought the Red Army was not particularly serious. We should remember, though, that this period, from 1939 to 41, I talked the other day on Friday about the kind of doctrinal phases of international communism. The Popular Front phase of collaboration with the socialists, supposedly against fascism. That was, of course, ended by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And for 2 years, Hitler and Stalin were literally allies. I mean, they were pretty close allies. Stalin didn't just give Hitler a free hand to take Poland. He promised, and in fact, he delivered on his promises to give the Nazis vast stores of things like oil, which obviously was very important for the German war machine, manganese, even some iron ore, cotton, grain. That is, he was helping to feed the voracious German army. In fact, they continued sending these materials to Germany right up to the German invasion of Russia in 1941. They were, in every de facto sense, even if not necessarily de jure, allies for almost 2 years, from August 1939 to June of 1941. Now, the Germans sent Stalin things in exchange. Mostly it was kind of high technology stuff, blueprints for the creation of warplanes, that sort of thing. Various designs and patents. They were actually collaborating. For the most part, the Russians gave the Germans materiel, which is to say physical hard stuff. The Germans mostly shared technology transfer. Along with, of course, giving the Russians, of course, a free hand to carve up Eastern Europe. Now, it's interesting because a lot of times if you ever get a Russian talking about the Second World War, there's a lot of bitterness, understandably, because in the end the Russians suffered more than probably any other country. They lost more men. They certainly did the vast bulk of the damage against Hitler's army in terms of numbers of casualties and battles and so on. They, of course, have a bitterness also because the Western Allies ultimately delayed the invasion of Western Europe until D-Day, not until June 1944. You always get an interesting reaction, though, if you remind the Russians that they were actually allied to Hitler for the first 2 years of the Second World War. This was actually quite significant strategically. One of the interesting what-ifs of the war that didn't quite happen is that as late as the spring of 1941, Britain considered Stalin Hitler's ally. Britain did not actually attack Russia, but Britain was preparing to right when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Why would Britain want to attack Russia? Well, because Russia was supplying virtually all of Hitler's oil. In fact, the British Air Force, the Royal Air Force, was very far along in its plans to begin bombing the oil fields of Baku and the Caspian in the spring of 1941. Now, Churchill, of course, wanted Hitler to invade the Soviet Union. He thought that would be fantastic. It would have actually made a lot more sense for Britain for Hitler to invade the Soviet Union. It made very little sense for Hitler strategically. But we'll get to that campaign in a moment. For now, let's just recap briefly what happens before Hitler invades the Soviet Union, thus really transforming the Second World War into something of not a war of attrition so much as almost a war of annihilation, which is what the Eastern Front was. Now, France falls, as I've said, in about 6 weeks, from roughly the 10th of May until about, I guess, 21 or 22 June 1940. The Battle of France was over in 6 weeks, mostly because, as I have said, the French were kind of preparing to fight the last war. That is, they were expecting, yet again, the Germans to wheel around from the right by way of Belgium. Now, the Germans did ultimately roll up Belgium and the Netherlands as well. They did a lot of this with kind of these short lightning strikes. I mean, paratroopers landing in fortresses and that sort of thing. But the main thrust was actually right into the heart of northern France through the Ardennes forest. Part of the kind of strategic tactical brilliance of it was that the French had not been expecting the Germans could use their tanks, particularly in such a heavily forested area. I don't think it's on this map. This map is a little too large. But basically what the Germans did was they cut the Allied armies in two, including almost all, if you remember, of the British army, which was to the north of the German pincer movement. And so while there were still French troops to the south, they were cut off from the main bulk of the French army, and morale was essentially destroyed. France, to recap, of course, ultimately chose Philippe Pétain as their leader, leading to the whole sordid and sorry saga of Vichy, which is to say collaboration. Britain was so upset with France, remember, for surrendering, that Britain even assaulted and sank the French Mediterranean fleet off the coast of Oran at Mers el Kabir. I mentioned this on Friday. Not all of you were here, but this episode was also memorable in that, somewhat ironically, although maybe not ironically if we know the British well, Churchill got his first standing ovation in the House of Commons when he announced that Britain had sunk the French fleet. It was, in a way, the first British victory of the war, and so it made sense that everyone cheered. But anyway, so briefly, in part because Hitler, if you remember, had called off the advance. They didn't not attack the British at Dunkirk. They did attack. There were serious casualties. Many men died. Many were taken prisoner. But the majority of British troops were able to be evacuated from Dunkirk. And all of these kind of fishing boats and trawlers, in addition to warships and merchant vessels, in part because Hitler had called a halt to the German attack. Because Hitler wanted to sound out the British essentially about a deal. Now, how serious and long-term this deal would be is, of course, an open question. The idea would essentially be that Hitler would agree not to disturb what was left of the British Empire in exchange for British recognition of German primacy in Europe. There were also talk of several British colonies, possibly in Africa, being handed over. Not sort of the real heart of the empire. Britain was not going to be asked to give up Egypt or India. Britain was basically to be allowed to remain more or less as it was, although Germany obviously would now be supreme. It could draw on the resources of Europe, so that the deal, while maybe a possible scenario for Britain under a different government, did not appeal to Churchill. Now, Churchill later claimed that he, of course, never even considered negotiating with the Nazis. This famous speech, we will fight them on the beaches, we will never surrender. It's not actually true. I mean, he did consider it. He gave it serious thought. There's still a strain in British revisionist thinking about the Second World War. There's even a strain of this in America, although it's not as strong, thinking that, in fact, the war in the end was a kind of mistake after 1940. That is, that Britain sacrificed its empire in order to defeat Hitler, at great cost, not just in men, lives, materiel, but literally losing its empire and its position of world primacy, which did happen. Basically, Britain ended the Second World War in hock to the Americans, who had inherited most of Britain's bases and coaling stations, along with, of course, the vast majority of Britain's debt, which was now owed to America. The war really did destroy the British Empire. And so Churchill, in some circles in England, has always had a bad press. He's generally seen as a hero by most of the Western world for standing up to Hitler alone. But there remains some controversy about whether it really was worth fighting on. Morally speaking, yes. Strategically speaking, it's an interesting question. So anyway, the British refuse to parley, in part because they don't want rumors getting out that they're even negotiating with Hitler. And so Hitler, somewhat angrily, of course, prepares to essentially assault Britain, although he can't quite invade Britain yet. They discussed it just as Napoleon did. I mean, there was a joke in the 1990s when they finally finished the channel, the Channel tunnel under which you could take the train now from Paris to London, that now the Germans won't have to use airplanes. The Germans could just hop on the train and invade England. A little bit like Napoleon tried and then failed to do. The problem faced by both Napoleon and Hitler was, of course, that they didn't control the seas, and so they really would not have been able to mount an effective amphibious operation. The Germans thought they might have been able to eventually, only so long as they controlled the air. And that's why they waged this famous Battle of Britain, the kind of aerial-only campaign, which was in two basic phases. In the first, the Germans really were trying to knock out the British Air Force, ideally, knocking out the planes on the ground, if not, then, beating them in the air in what they called dogfights. But once it became clear that Germany was not making headway, Hitler somewhat fatefully ordered his planes, the famous Luftwaffe, simply to start bombing London. Essentially kind of civilian terror bombing. And this is partly because the British enjoyed a major advantage. There's a myth that the Germans, of course, were superior in all technologies. They were superior in some. They definitely had impressive rocketry. By the end of the Second World War, the kind of early Cold War joke, or at least was more than a joke because it was serious, but between the Americans and the Russians was, our German rocket scientists are smarter than your German rocket scientists. There were, of course, other refugees, particularly German Jews like Einstein, who ended up helping, inspire and work with the Manhattan Project, which produced the nuclear bomb. The Germans were far ahead in things like chemicals, synthetics. They were able to essentially manufacture liquid petroleum oil, from coal, which was rather remarkable. On the other hand, the Russian tank, the T-34, was actually superior to the German tank, although it was originally based on German designs. And more significantly, Britain had far superior intelligence. Radar basically allowing the British to track these German flights. The Germans had nothing like radar. They didn't even know it existed, which was a serious advantage for the British. The other major advantage the British had was in code breaking, and this was true on the American side too. They broke the famous German Enigma codes. Bletchley Park, actually the subject of a movie we might watch after the midterm. There are a couple of possible movies actually called Enigma, which was about the code breakers. This allowed the British, by, shall we say, like the middle of the war, to know virtually everything that the Germans were doing. In fact, somewhat faithfully, and again to return the controversy about Russia and whether the Russians felt victimized by the Western powers, the British actually shared all of the intelligence that they had on the German army with the Russians. So Britain had certain technological advances. Radar essentially helped them win the Battle of Britain in the air. Although in the end there was a lot of damage to London, it did not damage civilian morale, which is what Hitler wanted it to do. It did much the opposite. It united all of Britain behind Churchill's pugnacious leadership. Now, Churchill, love him or hate him, and there are a lot of things that you can definitely argue about in terms of his policies in both of the world wars. The man had guts. I talked about how in the First World War, after Churchill had been essentially scapegoated and blamed for the Gallipoli campaign, he was thrown from office and basically just out of government. Instead of writing some kind of like angry screed in the press and attacking his enemies, he actually went to fight on the Western Front. He actually went to fight in the trenches on the Western Front, risking his own life. In the Second World War, the famous stories about Churchill, although they did have this bunker, underneath Downing Street, where the government, you could actually go visit it today if you ever visit London. It is true they had a bunker which was supposed to be safe, from the falling bombs. However, when the bombs would start falling, Churchill usually went up to the roof because he liked to watch. The man had, as the Hispanics like to say, cojones. That's not to say necessarily, again, that his policies in the end served Britain well. It's interesting that, in a way, it was almost like a kind of national suicide. Britain stood for pride and honor against Hitler, and in the end, Britain lost her empire. Meanwhile, Hitler, frustrated that he's not able to knock Britain out of the war, first in the air, and basically it means they can't invade England. So he kind of has to give up. Couple of things he does. He's thinking about other ways of defeating Britain. Remember that although in the end you had this huge coalition, in 1940 Britain was alone. Hitler only had to face the British. So he looks at a couple strategies. One of the more interesting of them was that he thought he might have been able to cut the British off from the Mediterranean by taking Gibraltar. Gibraltar, of course, the kind of great big rock, really. Sort of like island rock, which guards the entrance to the Mediterranean from the Atlantic. Very important strategic nodal point of the British Empire and the British Navy. He could only do this, of course, if essentially the Spanish let him. And so he went to Franco, the man that in a way Hitler had helped put into power by arming him during the Spanish Civil War. And Franco essentially told him to put it where the sun don't shine. Franco told Hitler off in a way probably no one did in the last 12 years of Hitler's life. Hitler apparently was shaking after his meeting with Franco. And this is partly because Franco was an old military man. He was a lifelong soldier, of extremely high rank. I don't remember whether he was field marshal by this point, but he was the Spanish equivalent. He was a man of kind of breeding, not necessarily learning, but he was certainly a man who took a lot of pride in his military bearing. And he saw Hitler as, well, Hitler's highest military rank was corporal. Hitler, in other words, was barely above subaltern in Franco's vision of basically what you valued a man by. So he had no respect for Hitler. He despised him. There was a little more to it than that. I think Franco also had, he had at least one Jewish niece. And so Franco, interestingly enough, despite his reputation as a quote-unquote fascist, was extremely, shall we say, not anti-Semitic. In fact, he despised the Nazis in part for their anti-Semitism. And it's a curious fact of the Second World War that if you were Jewish and you were in Europe during the Holocaust, your best chances of emerging alive were in Franco's Spain. So Franco was not a tool of Hitler. The French, remember, had petitioned Hitler for alliance, and Hitler said no. Hitler petitioned Spain for an alliance, and Franco said no. So this knocked off at least one major possibility for the Germans, that is, of cutting off the British from the entrance to the Mediterranean. Now, the other possibility Hitler might have considered, and he certainly considered it, was attacking the British, of course, in Cairo. Basically knocking the British out of Egypt, severing the Suez Canal, which was the key linchpin of the British Empire, all the sea routes to India, and then possibly even going through the Middle East. Of course, Turkey would have been one possibility. The Germans could have invaded Turkey in the end, partly because they did need some materials they got from Turkey, certain strategic metals, also because the Turks, of course, were pursuing a very adamant policy of trying to stay neutral in the war. Hitler, I guess he just in the end wasn't interested. The Middle Eastern strategy, or at least the Middle Eastern option, was probably, strategically speaking, the best one for Hitler. In the end, most military analysts and historians think that had the Germans devoted even 1/5 of the resources they devoted to invading Russia, that is, sending them instead by way of Cairo into the Middle East, they probably could have made it as far as India, following in the path of Alexander the Great. Very little serious armed opposition would have met them. They had certainly prestige in that part of the world, some of it going back to the First World War. There might have been the odd rebellion here and there, but as far as effective armed resistance to what was, after all, a formidable fighting machine, the German army, there probably would have been little to stop them. Now, this does open up another interesting what-if involving Japan. That is, had the Germans actually coordinated measures with Japan. Now, briefly about the Japanese, we're going to have a little more time to look at them on Friday. But as far as their role in the Second World War, I mean, we usually just look at the two sides in the war. We kind of summarize it as Axis versus Allies. That's how it is in, of course, the board games usually, right? You either are the Axis or the Allies. So supposedly you've got Italy, Japan, Germany. They're allies on one side. And then, of course, eventually you had Britain, America, and Russia, allies on the other side. The Axis against the Allies. Well, the military alliance on the Axis side was never anything close to an alliance. There was virtually no coordination. There was nothing like there was on the Allied side, where eventually you got the so-called SHAPE, or Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Forces in Europe, which eventually, of course, evolved into the NATO alliance after the war. Absolutely no unified command on the other side. The Germans, yeah, supposedly they called the Japanese in their kind of racial hierarchy, they were honorary Aryans. And the idea was that the Japanese were not, say, as high as, the whites and the Saxons and the Germans, but on the other hand, they had a homogeneous kind of a racial nation, of great strength, the warrior code. The Germans had a lot of respect for the Japanese, even if they didn't see them as quite their equivalent. They also had respect, of course, for, shall we say, Japanese courage and behavior in the international sphere. A similar approach, kind of to pariah states, of course, behaving lawlessly as predators. Japan, in some ways, had, if you want to date the war even further back, you could say they had really gotten the thing going, first by invading Manchuria in 1930-31. Remember, the Japanese have never actually left the Asian mainland since the First World War. They had fought against the Bolsheviks in kind of eastern Siberia during the Russian Civil War. They kept troops there. There were border skirmishes from time to time. The war between Japan and Russia had never really stopped. It wasn't really in a particularly hot phase. But now they were also moving further south into Manchuria. And then in 1937, they invade China. There's a famous episode in Nanking, usually called the Rape of Nanking. The Japanese commit a number of atrocities. They start kind of bringing in, slave labor. They develop something like the concentration camps the Germans have, even though they're slightly different. You know, eventually they take also people from Korea and other places in Asia, and they hired what they would call, you know, you're sort of like geisha girls, you know, women who were almost like enslaved into sex slavery for the Japanese army. It's pretty ugly, and you know, it's not necessarily that successful. They do take most of the cities in China. But what basically happens is that especially Mao, this famous Long March. I haven't really talked about the Chinese revolutionaries yet. We'll have another lecture for that. But Chiang Kai-shek and Mao, with their various forces, their various armies, retreat into the interior. They keep their fighting forces intact. So even though Japan controls the cities, they haven't really damped out resistance in the larger country. The Chinese campaign turns into one of those kind of endless pits where Japan just has to send in more money, more men, more resources. It's successful on the surface, but it doesn't really seem to be going that well. So the dilemma for Japan, as far as strategy. Now the Japanese, part of the reason that they are kind of reaching out in this imperial way, some of it has to do with demographics and population. The islands, of course, are fairly small. They're not as small as sometimes people say. Like this week when we were talking about the nuclear reactor, there was all this paranoia about Tokyo, which is in fact more than 200 miles away. The islands are not as tiny as you might sometimes think. That said, Japan is still a pretty small country, an island nation like Britain with a larger population, so that there was a kind of logic. In the same way the European empires expanded to find, in part, new markets, but also new places for their burgeoning population to settle. The Japanese phenomenon was similar in that sense. They were expanding almost inevitably as they became richer and more powerful. Although, of course, part of it was also the failure of civilian government. By the late 1930s, you really had no functioning civilian government. The military had more or less taken over. You still had an emperor who was the nominal head of state, Hirohito, but the army, and particularly its chiefs of staff, are now kind of running things. Now, inside the army, there is a debate. It's really, in some ways, between the army and the navy. This is often true with any kind of country that has significantly large armed forces, that you have, obviously, the different service branches, and they all have their own agendas. The Navy, for the most part, was interested in what it called a kind of southern strategy, because, of course, it would give the Navy something to do, which was to roll up islands, places like the Philippines, maybe the British garrison at Manila, the Americans in the Philippines at Manila, Singapore, possibly even Australia eventually, essentially kind of turning the Pacific into a Japanese lake, you know, at least the Western Pacific, such that the Japanese would eventually have room to expand raw materials. Another thing that they lacked, of course. They lacked things like rubber, they lacked things like oil, which they still lack today. You know, Japan, part of the reason that, like France, they built a lot of nuclear reactors is they just don't have a lot of their own energy resources. So this strategy, it made sense in certain terms. The problem, of course, was that it would require going to war with countries like Britain, France, and Indochina. The Netherlands, of course, and Indonesia, and Sumatra, the US, and places like Philippines, possibly Hawaii. So that was the argument against it. You know, you draw up war against all of these powers. However, we could cross at least two of these powers off the list by the summer of 1940 because they no longer existed. France and the Netherlands were now Nazi satellites. So that kind of argued a little bit in favor of the southern strategy. Now, the northern strategy would have been the one, again, where you concentrate on more or less turning China into a Japanese colony, but more than that, on the struggle with the Russians for control of Siberia. This would, of course, give the army something to do, because it would be mostly a land campaign. This, in a way, is the campaign they had been pursuing for most of the last several years, with the invasion of China, already controlling Manchuria. There were skirmishes from time to time, even with the Russians. The interesting thing about these two strategies, though, is that the northern strategy obviously would have made a lot more sense if Germany were coordinating measures with Japan. After all, Germany was about to invade Russia. Although, curiously enough, the Japanese didn't know that because the Germans didn't tell them. One of the strangest aspects of the Second World War is the almost preposterous lack of communication between the Germans and their supposed Japanese allies. In fact, way back at the time of the Nazi-Soviet pact, now, you might think this would have been interest to Japan. Right, 1939, Japan is at war in China. They're skirmishing with the Russians in Siberia. Germany is supposedly hostile to Russia. They even had this thing they called the Anti-Comintern Pact, a political treaty signed in 1935. That is, Germany and Japan agreed. The Comintern, the Communist International, it was meant to be a political sounding treaty, but basically it was an anti-Russian treaty, right? We will together defeat the Russians. So theoretically, Germany is violating its own treaty with Japan in order to cut a deal with Stalin to free up Hitler's hand in Western Europe. They told him about it about a day before it happened. They gave them no warning. Now, amazingly, it got even worse in a way in the spring of 1941. We know from documents that emerged after the war, from conversations between Hitler and his generals, that Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union round about December of 1940. In fact, originally he wanted to invade, weirdly enough, in the winter, before his generals at least convinced him that that wasn't such a good idea, invading Russia in the winter. We know that Hitler made this decision about December of 1940. The Japanese signed their own neutrality pact, their own version of like the Nazi-Soviet pact, in April of 1941. That is, they signed a pact to put their war with Russia on ice so that they could pursue a southern strategy, against essentially the kind of Western powers and their outposts in Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific. They had signed this treaty with Russia without even knowing, bizarrely enough, that the Germans were about to invade Russia. In fact, the man who signed this, Admiral Nagano, he actually said that had he learned of Hitler's plans to invade the Soviet Union, he wouldn't have signed the Neutrality Pact, because he signed it in the assumption that Germany and Russia would not go to war because they were, of course, functioning as allies. Hitler did not tell the Japanese that he was about to invade the Soviet Union. So the Japanese proceeded with their southern strategy. Now, the other thing which at least kind of made sense of the southern strategy from the Japanese perspective was the U.S. had already enacted certain sanctions on Japan, for the trade in certain kind of strategic materials. But the most important of them, of course, was oil. And this was in the 28th of July, 1941. Now, in today's world, it would actually be much harder for the U.S. to enforce an embargo on oil, because as we all know, the U.S. itself imports the majority of its own oil, so the U.S. doesn't really have all that much leverage unless it can get other countries to play along. In 1941, the U.S. was still the world's leading oil producer, and by a large margin. So when the U.S. embargoed the Japanese, that is, they embargoed shipments of oil, they were actually able to put teeth behind it. That is, basically, they stopped shipping oil to Japan. Such that it was a kind of almost like a ticking time bomb. The Japanese economy obviously depended on oil imports. So did, of course, its armies occupying Manchuria, China, and so on. So you could make the argument, that is, that it made sense for Japan to strike proactively, preemptively against whomever, maybe the Americans, in order to eventually secure its own oil supplies, mostly in essentially Southeast Asia and the southwestern Pacific Ocean, where the oil resources were not as great as in America, but at least Japan could then maybe have its own sources of supply. That was the argument of the admirals behind the southern strategy. It's interesting, though, there's this fascinating exchange when they finally put this southern strategy. This is like in the fall, I think September of 1941. They're beginning to plan for Pearl Harbor. They haven't quite made the decision yet, but they're looking into it. And so now the chiefs have to at least get the nominal approval of the Emperor Hirohito. And so here's how they pitch it. They say, look, this whole China thing, okay, it didn't go well, so we're going to abandon the northern strategy. We're going to go for the southern strategy. As the Army Chief of Staff, his name is Sugiyama, although Nagano, in a way, is the one who really pitches it because he's the admiral of the Navy. He says, China is a continent. The South consists mostly of islands. So anyway, it's much easier. Islands, continent. We'll go for islands. The Emperor says, If the interior of China is large, is not the Pacific Ocean even larger? How can you be sure that the war will be over in 3 months, as you promise? And that's actually what they said. They said, well, we'll knock the Americans out at Pearl Harbor, and we'll basically conquer Manila, we'll conquer Singapore, Malay, we'll basically roll up the French in Indochina, we'll kick the Dutch out of their own whatever they have left in their colonies, and we'll do this all. The war will be over in 3 months. That's the plan anyway. Amazingly, they actually did all of this in less than 6 months. They actually conquered all of these territories in less than 6 months. Interestingly, Singapore in some ways was the key and the most shocking reversal. I don't have a good map of the war in Asia for you. I was looking for one online today. I couldn't find one. But anyway, Singapore, it was significant in part as a symbolic, because it basically controls the Straits of Malacca, which is a major choke point of even today global commerce. That's where something like 1/3 to 1/2, I think, of the merchant shipping in terms of value. Almost all of the oil that now goes to Asia goes through the Straits of Malacca. So Singapore is extremely important strategically. It was also in some ways the most heavily fortified British base in all of Asia. Britain had, in fact, Churchill had famously given a guarantee to Roosevelt, even before America joined the war, that Singapore will hold, and you don't have to worry about Singapore. Curiously, though, Churchill, in his kind of almost euphoria after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, thus dealing eventually Hitler the key strategic blow, he agreed to send 200 state-of-the-art British warplanes to Russia, which were supposed to reinforce Singapore. It was a decision that he didn't even consult his cabinet about. It was just one of Churchill's kind of impulse moves, which, again, helped the Russians, did not help the British. Eventually, Singapore fell. It was partly due to bluff. The British claimed they were running out of ammunition and supplies. It turned out the Japanese were even lower on supplies and ammunition than the British were. But anyway, Japanese morale was probably stronger than that of the British garrison, so Japan rolls all of this up. Before the war even began, though, another fascinating thing, I talked about how Britain, remember, had basically neglected Singapore by sending these warplanes to Russia instead. Stalin had such good intelligence on the Japanese intentions. He had a spy called Victor Sorge in Tokyo who pretty much knew everything that was going on in the Soviet government. They promised him by October, which, if you look at your dates, is still almost 2 months before Pearl Harbor. They now knew that Japan was going to essentially pursue a southern strategy, attack the Americans. So they told Stalin, you can pull all your troops out of Siberia, that is, and throw them against the Germans. He actually withdrew 20 divisions from the Asian theater to launch them against the Germans because he knew that Japan was not going to attack him. Now, this is what you do when you have good intelligence. Weirdly, Hitler not only, of course, had not told the Japanese before he invaded Russia that he was going to do so, but now, right before Pearl Harbor, Hitler, through his foreign minister, Joachim Ribbentrop, the same who had signed the Soviet Pact, he actually assured the Japanese shortly before Pearl Harbor. He didn't know about Pearl Harbor, but they knew that Japan was thinking about a southern strategy. Hitler actually assured the Japanese that no matter what they did in Asia, Germany would declare war on America. He actually promised them that, proactively, without anything in return. So that Japan not only now basically knew that Hitler was kind of going to go along with them, they had really nothing to worry about. So they went ahead, of course, with the famous assault on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy, as Roosevelt famously put it to Congress. There is an interesting kind of a thread, almost not quite a conspiracy theory, but an idea that the Americans knew the attack was coming, that Roosevelt all along had wanted to fight Japan, so they didn't properly prepare for it. There were certainly hints of some kind of operation in the wings. But honestly, no one expected Pearl Harbor, simply because, again, I don't have a map of the Pacific, but you'll just have to take my word for it. It's a long way from Japan. It was a truly impressive military operation in terms of the coordination, the use of aircraft carriers, refueling at sea. It was unprecedented in the scope of its conception, and to a certain extent even in the success of the operation. They damaged or sank as many as 18 American warships, including large state-of-the-art battleships battleships and several aircraft carriers. However, they were sunk in shallow water. So many of them were actually able to be retrieved, brought back to the surface, repaired, and then floated again. So although on the surface it was a stunningly successful operation, in the short run, even the Americans were able to make good many of their losses. They did lose, of course, also several thousand soldiers, which in some ways was strategically more significant because, of course, an unprovoked attack of this sort, causing such tremendous losses in human life, produced immediate unanimity of opinion in America, a country which already had plenty of grounds for kind of anti-Japanese sentiment, some of it even due to competition from the Japanese and kind of the American economy, some of it due certainly to the kind of racist ideas which were then still prevalent, talk about the yellow peril and all of this. But now, whatever before was prejudice was now a kind of legitimate grievance. A grievance which turned rapidly into almost a passionate loathing hatred of the Japanese, easily whipped up, which of course forced America really very rapidly to ramp up its industrial capacity. The Japanese kind of knew this was coming. It's curious that when they actually talked about the prospects of the war a little more seriously, the Japanese more or less knew they would lose. I mean, this in a way is the strangest thing about the Pearl Harbor attack. After this question that I hinted about, is not the Pacific Ocean even bigger than China? Nagano, who is in charge of the Navy, he tried to explain to the emperor how it might go. He says, well, if I'm told to fight regardless of consequences, that is, if I can just attack whomever I want, however I want, I shall run wild considerably for 6 months or a year. That is, he'll be able to defeat the Americans in the short run, probably defeat the British, whatever is left of the Dutch and French garrisons. Shouldn't be too difficult. However, he said, I have utterly no confidence in the second and third years. Even more colorfully, Tojo put it, how was it he put it like this? Tojo actually described, he said that the Japanese should learn to take courageous acts, like the jumping off of temples with their eyes closed. This whole kind of suicide phenomenon, which later emerged with the kamikaze bombers, literally was like, we need to learn how to jump off temples with our eyes closed. That, in a way, was the level of strategic thinking. There was another exchange, I think, which captured it even more interestingly. This is between Nagano, the Navy Chief of Staff, and the Finance Minister, who has to think about paying for the war and the economy and all of this. And anyway, so the Finance Minister asks him, if we go along at present without war, and then 3 years later, the American fleet attacks us, will the Navy have a chance of winning? Nagano, nobody knows. I don't know. Will the American fleet come to attack us? I don't know. I don't think they will come. Nagano says, we might avoid war now, but go to war 3 years later. Or we might go to war now and plan for what the situation will be 3 years later. I think it would be easier to engage in war now, even though I don't think we can win. That was pretty much the sophistication of Japanese strategic thinking. It was, in some sense, a kind of act of almost harikari, the attack on the Americans. But it had very serious consequences even in Europe, because 4 days after the Japanese attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor, thus, again, igniting this kind of ferocious, patriotic, militant sentiment in America, Hitler declared war on the US, just as he had promised the Japanese he would. He didn't have to do this. America had not attacked him. In fact, there's a curious aspect to all this. It's always true of the Americans in the 20th century, probably a little less so now, that despite their kind of global power, their position at the center of the world economy, their immense strategic potential, there always was a certain provinciality to Americans, even in Washington. There's a funny story, supposedly, about what happens shortly after Hitler declares war. Hitler has all of these kind of satellite states and allies. Like if you look at the map, a lot of this territory the Germans simply conquer, but other countries like Hungary just more or less threw in its lot with Hitler and said, look, Hitler is the wave of the future, we will join the Nazis. He didn't have to invade Hungary. They just said, we'll join you. Yugoslavia, they did invade. But, Romania just kind of voluntarily decided to join the coalition. Well, anyway, when one of these ambassadors, I think it was the Hungarian ambassador, came to the White House after Hitler had declared war on America, it was his duty, of course, as an ally of Hitler, to declare war on America. And he said, having no prejudice against the Americans himself, he said, I'm sorry, it is my unfortunate duty, one I do not relish at all, that I have to announce that our country is now in a state of war with yours. And, the White House official who received him said, oh, yes, very well, thank you. And where is your country? I don't think they even knew, honestly. I mean, some people did, but not every American knew where Hungary was on the map. And now, simply because Hitler declares war on America, because Japan attacked America, now all these satellite states in Eastern Europe are in a state of war with the Americans. Now, some of them, of course, will later switch sides. Romania, of course, most creatively. Just once they basically realized Hitler was losing the war, they just switched right to the other side. Now, Turkey was a little more elegant about it. Turkey was always neutral, but in the first couple of years of the war, they were a lot friendlier to the Germans. Just kind of in terms of, they would pass, laws not really expropriating Jews or anything like that, but, heavier taxes on the Jews, sweetheart deals for Hitler with, things like medals. And then, of course, by about 1943, they realized the war was going the other way, and so then they got a lot friendlier with the Western Allies. That made perfect sense. And in some ways, if you're a small country and you don't really have global power, yes, are we?
So what's the drive for Germany to declare war on the United States?
That's a very good question.
Yeah, because they have no benefit from it. Right?
There's no benefit from it. Well, no, there is possibly one benefit. They could immediately start to attack American shipping in the Atlantic Ocean. That was the only possible strategic advantage. The U-boats, famously, of course, in the First World War, they weren't terribly sophisticated. They would really only dive very briefly under the water. They were basically surface ships that had the capacity to go underwater. The U-boats in the Second World War could stay underwater for much longer. They were a lot more sophisticated. Their torpedoes also had much greater destructive power. So that the Battle of the Atlantic was certainly important. They now could attack American shipping without they're at war now, so there are no limits in the way that there were before. So maybe that was a small thing. If they had been able to disable shipping, such as they were able to basically starve Britain of supplies and materials and food, there might have been a potential benefit to Hitler. It wasn't just so. They didn't have enough U-boats to begin with to do this. And besides which, because the British had broken the codes, this is the subject of this excellent movie called Enigma, which is actually largely about the Atlantic. What happened was that eventually they were able to arrange convoys, and they were able to track the movements of some of the German subs, enough to avoid the worst damage. Still, that said, they did destroy immense tonnage of Allied shipping in 1941, 1942. It was analogical in some ways to what the Germans did in 1917, if you remember, with unrestricted submarine warfare. But honestly, that was it. Because America, in fact, not only would now be at war with Germany, but because Roosevelt had always been of the opinion that the Germans were a greater threat than the Japanese, he actually agreed with Churchill that the European theater of war would be a higher priority for the Allies. Had Hitler not declared war, there's probably little chance that Roosevelt could have gotten a declaration of war against Germany through Congress. I mean, you think about it from just a basic political perspective. The Germans were not the ones who had attacked America. The Japanese were. America was up in arms and angry at the Japanese. No, they weren't necessarily in favor of what Hitler was doing, but there wasn't a huge amount of anti-Hitler sentiment in America in the same way that there was anti-Japanese sentiment. And the German population, or people of Germanic descent, was still enormous. Roosevelt was he was in a stronger position politically than Wilson had been in the First World War. But that said, he was not by any means impregnable. He depended on the upper Midwest, the area of America, particularly around Wisconsin and Chicago, which had always been heavily Germanic. It was part of his electoral coalition. Now, he might have been able to risk it. It's true, he wasn't up for re-election again. He was already in his third term until 1940. But it does create a great what if. had Hitler not declared war on the Americans. A much greater what if, of course, is had Hitler not declared war on Russia and invaded Russia. But that is a much bigger subject, and one which I think, are we towards the end of the first hour? I'm just checking the time. Yeah. We're going to take, I'll call it 5 minutes. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and when we get back, we're going to look at Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union.